Hello folks, welcome to el canal de Chano Jose. Today we got a video about gauges, and our car has every single car out there has gauges on the dash. They might be digital, they might be mechanical, but these gauges, you got speedometer, you got RPMs, you got lights, you got all these gauges and all these lights in the dash. But there's three very important gauges that your car must have working properly, because if they don't work and you don't realize that these gauges are not working properly, you can cause a problem to your car, or you can even damage your engine or some components because these gauges are not working properly. And with that said, we're going to show you the three most important gauges that we find in our car. And with that said, let's get started. So right on our dash we have the cluster, and the cluster has gauges for the speedometer, RPMs, and all the other little things that go on the car pretty much are right here. But there's three main ones, and the first one is the oil pressure gauge or light. And if that light is not working properly or the gauge is not reading correctly, you can create a problem. And what that gauge can cause if it's not reading correctly, and if we're waiting for the light or the gauge to read all the time correctly and it's not doing its job, well, this is what can happen. So most people, when they're driving their car, they rarely open the hood and check for oil level, and we are always just basing on checking the gauge on the dash. But what about if that gauge doesn't work correctly or the light doesn't work at all? So you are just driving your car all the time, and then that oil level starts dropping, and what can that cause? So if the engine runs out of oil, what that's going to cause is the engine is going to break down. All the friction that is happening inside, and with no lubrication, the engine is just gonna ruin itself. The engine is gonna starve of oil, and it's just gonna seize itself. So if the best thing to do is that if you want to make sure that your light on the dash is working correctly and the gauge is reading correctly, what you do is you want to always check your dipstick and make sure that the oil level is up to the level that it needs to be. And if it's low, it's probably because the light is working properly and it's telling you, hey, we got low oil pressure, so there's something wrong with the oil pump, or the level of the oil is low. So if you check the dipstick and you match what is reading on the dipstick to what the light is telling you, then once you add more oil recommended by the manufacturer, then you add that oil, and then the level comes up, then you verify it on the dipstick, and then next time when you turn on your car, that light is gonna go off, it's gonna go away, and that's reading correctly. So if that light is not reading correctly, or the gauge is not reading correctly, and you're always thinking that the gauge is good, but in reality it's not reading right, and the dipstick, when you pull it off, there's no oil, then the light or the gauge is lying to you, and that's gonna cause a breakdown on your engine, and now you're gonna end up paying a lot of money for a brand new engine or for another car, when you could just added some oil and avoid it because the gauge is not working. So that's why the gauge needs to be working properly, and if it's not working properly, you can always have a second choice of using your dipstick to check the oil level and see if it needs oil or is up to the level. So another important gauge is your temperature gauge. This is very critical in an engine because the engine has to operate a certain temperature, and as we see the temperature rise, it has to reach a normal operational temperature for the engine. Sometimes that's why the RPMs are a little higher in the morning, because it's cold, the engine is trying to reach the temperature, and then the RPMs start dropping because that temperature has been reached and the engine is now performing at its normal temperature of operation. So it's like drinking a coffee. You don't just take the sip right away. You see if the vapor is coming up, then you taste it a little bit, and then you start feeling for the temperature as soon as you grab the cup. So if it's too hot, you're not gonna drink it. So that's indications that it might be too hot. Same thing for a car. It needs some sort of an indication or a gauge to tell you, hey, the car is cold or the car is hot. So if it starts overheating, if the gauge is not working properly, you're not going to find out until it's too late and there's steam coming out under the hood, and now you have to get to the side. And what about if you're in an area where there's no cell phone service and now you're stuck? If that gauge don't work, you want to make sure why it's not working. If it's the temperature sensor, if it's the gauge, you want to get the gauge fixed and taken care of, because it can save you hundreds or thousands of dollars of replacing the engine, or maybe even your car, when it could have been just the sensor. And then you get your gauge working properly. That gauge starts reading high now, and it starts getting hot or overheated. It gives you a chance to pull over, investigate what's going on. Then it might need just some antifreeze, or it might be something mechanical, or there's a erupted hose that needs to be replaced. So that's gonna give you a chance to see what's going on. And once in a while, it's good to pop your hood, open it, and take a look at the antifreeze, the color, the level, if it's consumption, there's a leaks anywhere. Because if you just turn on your car and drive, and you base on yourself on that gauge, and that gauge is not working properly, you might end up in the side of the road, even with a broken car. Now you gotta replace the engine, rebuild, or even the whole car, when you could avoid that just by replacing a little simple thing. Now, another gauge that needs to be working correctly on your dash is the fuel level gauge. Is very important, because if you're used to your car and you're driving back and forth in town, and you're basing yourself in how many miles you're driving or kilometers, and then after so much kilometers, you know that you're close to empty, and then you go refill it, and you base yourself just on distance. What about if a family member gets to borrow that car, and they go for a trip, but they don't know that the fuel gauge is not working properly? What about if it's showing 3/4? They go fill it up, and then they don't realize that the gauge didn't move, and then they keep driving, and they base, oh, I got 3/4 of a tank. And what about they run out of gas in an area that is dangerous, and it's at night, and all that kind of bad stuff? So when you could avoid that situation just by replacing the fuel sending unit, or the gauge, the sending unit that reads the level of the fuel in the tank, when that could have been just the problem, and then now you would have a working gauge. So now, because that gauge is not working properly, you're on the side of the road with an empty gas tank, and now you're in the middle of the night. Now you gotta find out a gas station where you can go buy some fuel for your car, just to get you back to town, or you gotta call a tow truck. And if there's no cell phone service on the area, then that'll be a bad scenario. So in the old times, they used to be where they used to measure fuel on the tanks by putting a stick, just like you would be dip stick on the oil to measure the level of the oil on the engine, but it would be for fuel. So they'll stick a rod in there, or a stick, and they'll bring it out, and depends on the depth, they'll be able to tell how many gallons or how much fuel there was in the tank. But with this new system, you don't have that option. There's no way you can put a stick in there and get the measurement of the tank. So now, if the gauge is not working, gotta find out why it's not working, so you can repair if it's the float or something in the tank, or it's in the dash. So that way you don't end up having to find fuel in the middle of the night in an area that you don't know. And well, folks, we wanted to share this information because this is basic stuff that can get you into trouble if you don't pay attention, if your gauges are working properly or not working, because you might end up in the side of the road with a broken engine, or run out of fuel because one of these gauges was not working properly. So to avoid that, try to find out why that gauge is not working properly, to fix it, so next time you're out in the road, you don't have to worry too much about that gauge, or calculate mileage, or all this kind of stuff, or temperature on the engine, so everything's working properly, and that way you can get from point A to point B with no trouble. Otherwise, you might end up in the middle of the night in a road that you don't know, trying to get some fuel, so you can just get back to a gas station to fill up your gas tank. And well, hopefully this video was useful. For our viewers who are not subscribed to our channel, please subscribe. If you like this video, give us thumbs up, share it, and we'll see you soon with more videos here en el canal El Chano José.